Welcome back to another episode of the Hustle Nation podcast. Today, we're going to talk about transitioning into leadership and what most people find is the hardest part. And I think for a lot of people, if you ask 100 people, you're probably going to get 75 different answers. And this is a topic that came up was like listener question. And we're going to talk about what is the hardest and how to overcome some of those things. Dustin, kick us off.
Yeah, sure. So as I've seen people transitioning into leadership, each one of these things, but I think there's a couple of things that I've seen are kind of biases as people are entering that leadership. It's an exciting time. This might be their first leadership position, but regardless, there's kind of three things that I've found to kind of coach new leaders as they're taking on that role. And the first one, so I'll just kind of all three of them. One is, don't underestimate the buy-in. Two is, have pause versus action. And three is really kind of 80-20 in your actions. Just to hit on really the first one, we can talk about that one first. Don't underestimate the buy-in. I think so many times as people are taking leadership positions, they likely were very good at whatever job they already had, right? So their individual contributor role, they were very good at it. And now they're kind of thrust into this, leading other people role. And they may have already had ideas and they may have had exposure and things like that. And so they have this kind of immediate dive into like, okay, how do I prove myself really, really quickly? And what I've actually seen is the most important thing is as a leader of other people now, you actually accomplish nothing on your own. And so that shift of it's not about what is just getting done. It has to get through other people. And so that focus of actually just how do I gain buy-in and build relationships with that team? Or maybe that's a team you were working with in the past. Maybe it's not, right? But either way, taking that time and not one meeting, not two meetings, right? This takes weeks and months because it's relationships. It's everyone is going through this mental stage of what does this mean to me, right? Like you might be excited because you've taken this new role, but most people on that team, what they're actually thinking about is what does this mean for me? And what is this going to change? What am I going to like? What am I not going to like? How do I predict what this new leader's behavior is going to be? And so that just taking a step back and taking a little bit of a pause to just say, how am I really just going to work with this team and create that buy-in, genuine buy-in of what we can accomplish together?
Yeah, I like that. I think everything you said is spot on. The way I see it is a little bit more elementary. I think kind of going back into maybe your first big job when you were a teenager in your 20s, maybe you were a manager of a retail store. And the thing that I go back to so often is politics and friendships. So often, if you want to be a leader or you're getting into that role, you have to cut out some of the things that maybe you have in your personal life, which is talking about some of your political or worldly beliefs. Because as we all know, especially in today's climate, we could bring that up and we are definitely going to offend someone or upset someone. The other part is friendships. So often when we're starting in our career or even earlier before that, we can and we do have friendships at work. But there's a very fine line between becoming or transitioning into a leader. And then what do we do with those friendships? Do we continue to build friendships and relationships? And if you listen to, Jocko Willink or, any type of military podcasts or read any military books, they draw a very fine line between building morale and relationships, but also stopping that at friendships. And not saying that's the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do, because it could vary a bit by industry. However, those are two things that jump out because ultimately, we want to have strong relationships, but we need to delineate between being a leader uh, and being able to lead people and delegate. And it becomes just so much more difficult when most of your direct reports are your friends or your good friends. And moving forward, as we transition into that, I think I kind of zoom out a little bit. It's very important to establish boundaries. And those are things you should be doing very early in your career, whether that be with your clients, with your team or not. And just ask yourself, what is important to me? What is sacred? And unfortunately, I've had to use this, as I'm sure you have too, Dustin, when your kids were younger, which is, there are certain times when I'm not going to take a phone call at 10 o'clock at night unless it's an emergency, especially on a Friday. I'm not going to let something interfere with my coaching of my daughter's basketball. That's the time that I've dedicated to that team. And while they may only be 10 years old, they're going to have my full attention during that time. And if I need to work later, I need to work later. But those are a couple of things that stand out to me.
Yeah, it's such a great point because to your point, as we're starting our career, we're starting in an organization, um, we your peer level, right? So as your peer level, you have things to share. Uh, you can vent to each other, you can challenge each other, right? And there's uh, you don't have accountability for anyone, right? And or responsibility for someone else's development. So that relationship, to your point, can be much more like a friendship. And it doesn't mean that someone as a leader can't be a friend, but it actually is two different relationships, right? So
Yeah.
you can be a friend here, but if you're a leader, and to me the difference is, and some of it is by personality type, but a friend is there to support you, to console you, to now that doesn't mean a friend isn't there necessarily to challenge you either, but as a leader, there's just much more of a slant towards how am I developing this person, right? How am I, and I think a lot of times people think, well, because I'm like your quote unquote boss, well then my job is to basically just hold you accountable and all that. And yes, holding your team accountable is one of the functions of being a leader, but it's also how are you holding them accountable, how are you managing and coaching them, and then how are you leading them, how are you inspiring them, how are versus as a friend, that may not be the relationship that you have, right? And so I think you're exactly right, and it's one of the hardest transitions I think of for myself. I remember vividly when I went from, so I started as a salesperson, and so I was among the sales team, and we would go to lunch together, we would go have a drink after work together, and we would talk about the different deals and the different challenges that we had, and all of that, to all of a sudden, now I am the sales leader, so now I'm their boss, I'm their leader. And it was a really hard transition because you suddenly realize that like those things that maybe filled your cup before are just going to be different. It didn't mean
Yeah.
I couldn't, go to lunch with them again, or have a drink after work with them again. Right. Like it wasn't necessarily that, but they were different. Right. Because, now I have to take off my friend hat a little bit and say like, look, I'm also my job is to invest in you. My job is to help develop you. My job is to help challenge you. And so, which is it's just a high, to me, it's just a different level. I don't know if it's a higher level or whatever, but it's a different role. It's a different approach. And it's actually one of the hardest challenges I think people face as they're making that transition, because especially if they're being promoted from within, if you're coming from outside, you don't even have that, right? So you have other challenges. You have a higher buy-in level usually and things like that, but you don't necessarily have that coming along with you.
Yeah. And to piggyback off that, this is something that was always hard for me early on because I tended to be a little bit more passive on things where I'm just like, oh, whatever. I don't care. I'm going to let it slide. And then as I got further into my career, I realized that, those things were bothering me, is eating at me, that I would just let things go, give people not just a second chance, but a third chance. And I finally kind of got to the conclusion where I'm like, no more Mr. Nice Guy. And it wasn't that I wasn't being nice. It was just that a switch had flipped. I read some books and it was, you're actually hurting someone by not giving them immediate feedback. And I thought to myself, I was like, oh, man, like if I go back to the situations where I was coached, especially very quickly, someone just addressed it and was like, hey, I noticed you're doing this. And here's why I think you shouldn't do it that way anymore. Let me kind of give you an example of what you should do differently instead. And I was like, you know what? Feedback is a gift. And if you're not providing that feedback, you don't have to do it in a way that's mean. You don't have to feel like a jerk. But if you do that and you get it done right away as you transition into leadership, you're going to feel like, oh boy, I nipped that in the bud. I took care of that. And now you are setting those expectations, you're setting those boundaries. And if that's consistent from you, I think you'll have a nice smooth transition. But to just take it one more
Yeah.
step further, a lot of people do not like micromanaging. And so I'm going to kind of peel back some layers here. And from working with kids, especially with youth coaching, I've learned a theory of modeling, and not like the traditional modeling you'd think of, but modeling versus telling people. So it's one thing to use your words and tell someone, hey, this is how we do things. This is our model. This is the process you should take. But as a leader of people, whether it be a team or a whole company, it's really important that you model, not just model behaviors like being engaged in meetings and staying off your phone and asking good questions and taking notes. If you model, your team will then model. And it's just kind of funny how that works, both with kids and with adults and in business, is a lot of things become contagious to a certain degree. So if
Mhm.
you start to model good behavior and good actions in meetings, other people will start to do the same. And then that becomes more of like, well, it's not like someone's telling me what to do. It's just that's what everyone else is doing. So that's what we start to do. And that seeps into your culture. But to take
Yeah.
that one step further, there's also the delineation of delegation versus micromanagement. And so I see so often on the internet people talking about leadership, and they say, well, you have to learn to delegate versus micromanage. But I think many times delegation turns into micromanaging. And so a couple things there is teaching by modeling, and then setting the expectation and setting timelines. So whether again you're working with your client or you're managing direct reports, it is so often to say, this is the model. Let's talk about what the expectations are and how to install this. And then if someone doesn't do it correctly, you can teach and you can reinforce those things. But it's a lot easier to give someone the leeway or the leash to be able to make mistakes, because that only further enhances a strong culture.
Mhm.
I think it's good, and you have to tell yourself, people learn from mistakes. Allow them the opportunity to screw something up, because most people will only get better. I know personally, I've learned a lot more from the screw ups, the L's, the mistakes, the mental errors, if you will, than I have from the victories. And so that's one thing as a leader that now I wish I knew was give people the opportunity to make mistakes. And by that opportunity, they will learn. And if you are modeling, you don't have to worry about micromanaging. You don't have to worry about delegating so much as it is continually leading and setting the expectations.
Yeah, I think I agree with all that. I think the one of the I actually I hate the word micromanaging now. I've discovered that, and the reason I hate it is because it's not that I believe in micromanaging, but I feel like a lot of times in corporate culture now it has shifted to micromanagement is someone's defense when they're being held accountable. And I think there's a difference, right? So like and I think talking to lots of people about this, I think micromanagement is a really hard thing because it means something different to everybody. Like, what does that really mean? And the simplest way I've seen it is micromanagement is really more when you're looking in the rearview mirror versus accountability is more windshield. And what I mean by that is if micromanagement is like looking back at your last week and hyper scrutinizing everything that that person did and in excruciating detail of what they did in the last week, versus accountability to me is setting very clear expectations of what needs to happen next and then following up on that, right? I think usually where people get frustrated with micromanagement is it's being talked about after the fact. Expectations and training wasn't happening up front. And then candidly, it's just a negative experience because the individual is like, well, I'm sorry, I didn't know that. Right. And so now I feel like I can't, you're almost playing scared, right? Because I feel like I can't do that thing because I'm afraid I'm going to do it wrong. I completely agree with the modeling piece because I think people will always follow somebody that is modeling the behavior, right? I think, the opposite of that is crazy. But I also think for new leaders to really think through the balance between micromanagement and accountability, because if you have no accountability, you're not going to be a successful leader. But if you micromanage, no one's gonna no one's gonna want to be on your team. And It's one of those kind of strong nuances, but kind of dividing between how am I setting expectations going forward, as opposed to kind of crying over spilled milk, for lack of better way of
Yeah.
saying it.
And I do think there's times where you need to have some micromanagement where there's individuals who may
Mhm,
be on the verge of a performance improvement plan type of thing.
mhm,
But the other thing that I'll just say, and probably one of my final thoughts is ask yourself, do you really want to manage people? Because if you're transitioning from a specialist to a manager role, it doesn't have to be a huge leap. It doesn't have to be a $25,000 career type of a leap either. But
mhm.
we are going from specialist to a more management of people, which brings in things like entitlement and emotions and feelings. And wherever you are, this is just a part of leadership, like it or not. And so you have to be wanting and willing to be able to do some of those things and know that if the thing you really love is creating content or working in spreadsheets or being a bean counter, whatever you want to call it, you're going to be doing less of the thing you love and more of the thing maybe you don't like. And I think it's okay. I know plenty of people who are highly intelligent and highly successful, but they've turned down opportunities to move up the corporate ladder because they don't want to deal with some of that. And
Mhm.
they know that they might be taking, a bit of a long-term loss in terms of salary and income, but they're okay with it because what they do is truly what makes them happy.
You
And
bet.
so I do think that's a question you need to ask yourself. Or maybe, how far do I want to go in managing people? Because there is a point where 80% of what you do is leadership and management of people, and 20% of the thing you actually love.
You bet. Yeah. And so I think, just to keep advancing, I think the all of those things are really critical as you start thinking through how are you going to create buy-in, right? Because all of those are behaviors on how am I going to get the team bought into, me as a leader? Because if you don't have that, it's going to be pushing, a boulder up, the hill, right? I do think the second thing, though, too, it kind of ties into this as well, which is as a new leader, there is an incredible bias towards action. And so many times, whether you're coming from the outside or you're being from promoted within, if you're coming from the outside, you might have, known about that industry or had previous experience. And so you have these solutions kind of prepackaged. And so you want to come in and create action so that everyone can look at you 90 days in and say, hey, this is the impact that I created. And look all this great stuff that I did. And from within, many ways the same way, right? It's I've been within this and I've seen it at the ground level, and this is the problems that need to be fixed and whatever. And I think it's really important as a new leader, every time we have anyone transitioning into a new leadership role, the first thing I tell them is, what everyone else is going to tell you is build your 90-day plan on how are you going to create the max amount of impact in the first 90 days. When in reality, the right plan is actually how do you do almost nothing in the first 90 days? How do you just ask questions, listen, learn, build relationships? And again, it doesn't mean you can't have any small quick wins, things like that, right? But I think so often what it really is about, the quick wins are less actually about maybe the long-term business impact. They tend to be more, how are you finding quick wins to get your team and the organization to understand that like you're there for them? Versus I think a lot of times the bias is just, I want to make this big, wide sweeping change and big impact. And the reason it doesn't work is because you haven't gotten the buy-in. And so you have all of these people on your team that are concerned, right? Of what is this going to mean to me and what's going to be the impact? And now all of a sudden you're kind of imparting all of this change on them that, by the way, may be misguided. Nearly every time someone moves into a leadership role, right? What they bring with them is these perceptions and complaints and concerns that they maybe had at this level. And then all of a sudden they get elevated and they start making these decisions only to find out 3 months later that they really only had half the story, right? Like there was some reason why the thing was the way that it was. And that doesn't mean it shouldn't be fixed. It just means that they were going in blind. And where I can say that this is proof positive that it works is every time we've had a leader wait those at least 60 days, right? Like, I mean, sometimes it's a bit like a puppy that just wants to run, right? But like 60 to 90 days really trying to do almost nothing and just continuing to hold on people and just say, like, let's just make sure, what is the problem we're trying to solve? What's it going to take to solve it? What, how do we prioritize these things? Because by doing that, you're going to alleviate those missteps, because until you've built that buy-in and that trust from the team, any misstep is amplified. And whether we like it or not, whether you come from the outside or the inside, your perspective is still very limited until you get in there, right? And so, maybe you're on a team of 10 and 4 people, you knew their world really well, but 6 you didn't, right? And maybe even knew all 10, or you think you knew all 10, but do you know how that fits into the overall organizational structure and things like that? So this, kind of, number one, how do you get buy-in? But number two, how do you pause versus have this innate bias for action?
You bring up a really good point about perception. And so many people think they have fears, really, is I think what it's about. Like, oh, people aren't gonna like me, people aren't gonna follow me, they're not gonna listen to me, all these things. And I find that just personally, most of them are wrong. It comes from nervousness, it comes from fear. And you should probably go into it with just an open mind of saying, I guess I don't know exactly what people are going to think and what they're going to do or how this is going to work. But I think that's the right mentality, Dustin. I think that's a good way to kind of close this is have an open mind and prepare yourself for that transition if that's something you really want, which will lead us very nicely into our next episode. Thanks for listening to another episode. We'll catch you on the flip side. Peace.